We're going to follow up Matteo's presentation with Adam Kleinman. I got to know Adam through Facebook, and we quickly became very good friends because of sharing a lot of politics, most of everything, but also our sort of like cynicism towards both the political world and the art world. But at the same time, not giving up hope in terms of using the art world or utilizing it for better art or for better projects, but also not giving up on the political world. Adam's an uncompromising critic. You can read the reviews that he's written about shows, sometimes good, often critical. One of those rare critics who actually does the job of critiquing art, not just like marketing it. One of the good examples of that was the review he wrote on the Venice Biennale 2013 for Art Agenda, which is an exemplary way if you want to know how to write criticism of shows. Maybe you want to like pull that up and read it. Even though it was revised several times to negotiate interest of several parties, but still it shows sort of like the rigor with which he approaches his subject. And he's interested in kind of like, he was part of this project which he kind of invited me to work on, which sort of like relates somehow to Matteo's presentation, because the show was a 3-part show at the Witte de Wit in Rotterdam. And it sort of like dealt with like the energy and Anthropocene in the first part. It dealt with information and computation in the second part, and then almost kind of like covered Alan's world of war on terror and in the third part, which was called War in the Age of, what was it called? War, I was in that show, I should know better.
Warfare.
Art in the Age of Asymmetrical Warfare. Yeah, so with this introduction, I'm also gonna like read his bio, and then we're gonna listen to Adam. Adam Kleinman is a writer, curator, educator, and sometime performer. Former Documenta 13 agent for public programming, he is currently editor-in-chief and adjunct curator at Witte de Wit Center for Contemporary Art, and associate curator at Office of Contemporary Art, Norway. Adam, please.
Can you hear me all right? Yeah? Okay. If you can't, just go like this and let me know, because there's no point in, not doing anything. Yeah, thanks everyone for inviting me. I just want to say also thank you for the introduction. A lot of those shows, of course, are done in consort with a lot of people, and this is also why I'm quite happy to be here. And I think we also should thank all of the support staff and everyone related who made this possible. And we're talking continuously about labor. We're talking about continuously, general intellect, or whatever you want to call universal consciousness or whatever. And we always have to remember the connections and how we're all doing it. You all know this, but it goes without saying, right? Or I mean, it needs to be said. So, as you can see, I contradict myself a lot. So I might do it, and you can hold me to it, or you can't. I'm going to do something a bit different. Hopefully you enjoy it. I'm going to do 2 things. I'm going to read an older paper that was written last year for the Venice Biennale for eFlux's super community on the question of, is the universe a supercomputer? Why I turned to it is because it ties together beasts, bots, war, computation, and all sorts of things with various histories. One caveat is I am a writer. This is coming more out of the tradition of what's generally called an essay, and it's a very different kind of form than what we've been hearing before. No hierarchies there, it's just 2 different things. And then what I'm going to do, I had promised to do one form of case study follow this up, but I decided to change it because it's going to actually overlap more, and I'm responding a little bit to things that have been going on today. And I'm actually going to revisit the punch card, so you're going to get a little more on that, except I'm going to actually look at not the card, the thing next to it. And then we're going to go into certain ways of how information is sorted and how that creates certain kinds of agency, and more importantly, what that means politically. As a caveat, before I get started, I'm going to talk about a lot of drones and all this stuff, and there's a lot of interest in the technology. People like gadgets and all that kind of stuff. Yeah, that's important. The machine is important. It has an agency, so on and so forth. But there's also distinctions to be made. Jeremy Shackhill, investigative journalist who has done a lot of work in a lot of the clandestine operations in the Middle East, generally led by the United States, has made a distinction here that I think is prescient, and that we might talk about things like drones and all of that, and we might like them, but don't forget that's the tool. And the thing that's important, or the thing to focus on, and we can debate this, is not that it exists, but also how it's used. And how it's used is through a policy of assassination. And that's what's more important than what it flies around. We can debate that, but anyway, I'm going to talk about one. This is what one of them sees. This thing is called Argus. It's actually called Argus IS. It's got a sub-title called An Almost Cock and Bull Story, which is also an English expression for bullshit. But it also happens to have relevance to characters that come up in this. I'll just read it, and we'll see how we go. And let me start timing myself. There we go. Okay, part 1, the all-seeing. The voice of God speaks. We're told we're not ready to see something special. It's classified. A camera tracks to the right and zooms in on a tarp covering an object. Dr. Yanis Antonidis, a scientist at BAE Systems, a private multinational defense, security, and aerospace company, interjects, quote, "It is important for the public to know," end quote. But he goes on, quote, "We are not allowed to expose some of the pieces that make up the sensors, so you get to look at pretty plastic curtains," end quote. Hiding underneath the covers lies Argus IS, or Autonomous Real-Time Ground Ubiquitous Surveillance Imaging System, a Defense Advanced Research Projects agency called DARPA, you've heard it mentioned a few times, project contracted out to BAE Systems. Clocking in at 1.8 gigapixels, Argus IS is, this is at the time of the writing, the world's most advanced video imaging device. As the NOVA, that's an American documentary program, as the NOVA documentary program Rise of the Drones continue, we learn of a rather odd but clever trick. In order to cut costs and fast-track the project, this hardware was made out of readily available parts. Specifically, 368 common cell phone cameras were appropriated and tiled to form one gigantic composite lens. When loaded onto an aircraft and lifted to an altitude of about 17,500 feet, I don't know what that is in meters, but Argus IS utilizes this mosaic, that's actually what that is, to record and broadcast a live feed that collectively scans 36 square miles of the Earth. It is, quote, equivalent to having up to 100 Predator drones look at an area the size of a medium-sized city at once, end quote. And each of its constituent eyes acts independently. Argus IS can zoom in at one scale while not losing sight of the overall scene. To escape its gaze, you'd have to be smaller than about 6 inches. Argus is also a backronym. Argus, or more specifically, Argus Panoptes, which is Greek for all-seeing, is the name of a legendary many-eyed giant. Fictive descriptions of him developed over time. At first, Argus only had 4 eyes. However, he was soon detailed with over 100, so that a few could go to sleep while several others remained open and alert. Engineers might call such a system of built-in redundancies today robust. The allusion to the monster by DARPA, The allusion to the monster by the DARPA surveillance project is technically apt. As soon as a track body leaves one of Argus IS's patchwork grids, another camera takes over to follow. But maybe something more is coded into the reference. In Book 1 of the Metamorphosis, the Greek poet Ovid writes the story of Io, the raped mistress of Jupiter, and how Jupiter transformed her into a heifer so as to hide her from the rage of his wife, Juno. Wise to the ruse, Juno captured the cow and sent Argus to detain her. Jupiter, distraught, dispatched the god Mercury to assassinate Argus so as to spring Io, and succeeded. To appease the angered Juno, if you'd like, here's a Dutch painting on the subject. We can go more into that if you want. But you'll see that's Juno, Argus's head's cut off there, his eyeballs are being given by Mercury to Juno, and we're going to talk about the peacock up there in the corner in a second. See, fun stuff, right? Mercury cut Argus's 100 eyes out and handed them over. In turn, Juno embedded each eye into the train of the peacock, her sacred animal. This is how the bird got its famous plumage. Juno is the Roman goddess of marriage, so this tale of infidelity and subterfuge can be read along familial lines. However, Juno not only presides over the household, but over the community in general, including the entire state. The symbol of the lightly fined Mercury, god of communication, secrets, borders, and finance, is worth remembering. By the way, guys, this is like 2 millennia before now, yeah? Just as a judiciary slap on the wrist. But you might be wondering, as the eyes of Argus became a peacock's plumage, does Argus IS become a bird as well? In addition to the Argus IS program, DARPA is currently, at the time, crowdfunding a project with Boeing called Solar Eagle, a program aimed at creating solar-powered unmanned aerial vehicles capable of staying aloft continuously for as much as 5 years, so a plane that's flying all the time for 5 years. When teamed with Argus IS, the camera, Solar Eagle may soon become the world's ultimate spy plane. Curiously, the eagle, or Aquila in Latin, is not the classical symbol of Juno, which is the peacock, but of the rapist, Jove, whose story is also told in the Metamorphosis. The eagle signifies Jove, Jupiter also, lightning strike, and by extension, the Aquila, the term, also became the standard of a Roman legion, which is an infantry unit which they used to subjugate most of the known world at the time, and its deadly force. An emblem this techno-tandem of Argus IS and Solar Eagle may too own when it covers all of our skies, and is likewise called upon not only to watch, but to guide missiles down upon the ground. How did such terrors come to pass? Okay, breath. Part 2, where Io really went. Remember, that's the raped mistress. In 1610, Galileo turned a telescope towards Jupiter and caught sight of the 4 moons circling the planet, one of which is also known as Io. The discovery rattled the world. Aristotelian cosmology, which declared that all heavenly bodies circled only the Earth, was proven wrong. Although geocentric thinking should have died then and there, we now focus our most powerful looking glasses not only upon the heavens, but have aimed them directly down on the earth at ourselves. In the brief for this meditation, I was asked, is the universe a gigantic computer? Instead, I would like to ask, are supercomputers universal in the sense of equality or universal justice, or are they simply ubiquitous? Furthermore, do they have a cosmology? And lastly, what is their nature when we train them on our planet? Part 3, when analogs go astray. As in the cases of both monsters' compound eyes, Darwin proposed that small and simple things come together to form increasingly complex systems. Take what we call the internet, a network of networks, as one example. I'm sure you've heard the folk song that the internet was designed as a defensive communications network to safeguard a chain of command during a Soviet nuclear attack. The concern it was built to address, if a single nuclear missile obliterated a given headquarters, how could new command centers be set up to utilize the larger communications networks not taken out by the blast? Said in another way, how is it possible to cut off the head of the snake and keep it alive? In the early 1960s, an engineer named Paul Barron, this is the Solar Eagle project, I forgot it. Paul Barron drew this, which Mohammad had shown earlier, and we can talk about this more at depth. It's a fascinating diagram, but we'll keep it up here for now. This is the guy who drew this, though, Paul Barron. In the early 1960s, engineer Paul Barron was working on the problem for RAND Corporation, which was, at the time, a think tank for the United States military. Realizing that the analog telephone switching network was too centralized and thus too sensitive, Barron proposed to spread command and control messages across a vast distributed digital network so robust that it would be statistically impossible to knock it out in total. Fearing criticism that such a system would take too long to build and be too expensive, Barron realized that, quote, this is Barron speaking, if you could chop up a network and it could still behave and work well, then there was no reason you had to make the links out of gold-plated parts. That's what telephone switchings were made out of. Since you don't care whether the network link has failed because of enemy action or just because it was cheaply built, it does the same thing. Now you could build reliable networks that were very reliable on unreliable parts. Redundancy is the key. Barron never got to make his network. He did, however, brief Leonard Kleinrock, then head of ARPA, now DARPA, project called ARPANET. Things started to ferment, and in 1969, ARPANET completed its first network message. The computer's in UCLA if you're ever out there and want to take a peek at it. The Soviets never attacked. Peacefully, ARPANET grew into bigger and separate but linked networks with names like CSNet, NSFNet, National Science Federation, and so forth. However, this system would soon get chopped up. Like Argus IS, Solar Eagle, and its countless other programs, ARPANET and its descendants are the result of federally co-funded public-private partnerships, often with a heavy industrial base, sometimes a military one. Although originally aimed at uniting universities and other research centers for educational purposes only, the National Science Federation net was soon privatized, thanks Al Gore, and gave way to our now totally commercialized internet. And like the rise of the drones and the rise of the bots, the rise of secretive and proprietary inter and intranets, which link both private and secure supercomputers, needs more discussion today. If the universe is a supercomputer, then we should be able to zoom in and check whether different galaxies and solar systems are contained within it. On a low level of magnification, we might eye the so-called internet and its evil twin, the darknet. Zooming more, we might find things like Silk Road, Tor, and so forth. We can talk about those later if you want. While these networks are popularly stigmatized, there are many other legitimate operations underway to devise various hidden connections between supercomputers so as to create asymmetrical economic advantages or disadvantages. Take, for example, the practice of high-frequency front-running, a legalized form of predatory insider trading achieved by direct linking of peering fiber networks. Or likewise, the 827-mile cable built and controlled by spread networks to offer private connections near the speed of light, ostensibly between Chicago's Mercantile Exchange and New Jersey's NASDAQ. These are stock markets. Fiber is denser than air, though. Oh, I'm flying. And as such, we are now trying to set up networks through the sky. This summer, this is last year, Facebook will launch Aquila. Remember that word? A multi-million-dollar Solar Eagle-like drone designed to bring internet access to 2 billion new clients in underdeveloped countries through laser-guided signals beamed down from above. With the initiative dubbed as Internet.org, one has to wonder if Facebook, a multi-billion-dollar corporation that plies its trade through the internet, might seek some inurement from its so-called nonprofit social program aimed at connecting the entire planet. We're told that, quote, we are all in it together, end quote, and a telling list of corporate partners are named. Coming back to the concept of cosmology, though, we need to start paying attention to where each of our new supercomputers and their networks come from, what their means are, and how they change over time. The question, as labor historian Simon Head has brought to the surface, is not about the nature of technology, but how it is deployed. Argus IS already proposes a frightening example of applied computing, and in the article, The Machines Are Coming, a recent New York Times op-ed by Zeynep Tefurki, opined, quote, computers do not just replace humans in the workplace, they shift the balance of power even more in favor of the employers. We can talk about that later if you want. If anything, this all sounds less than stellar. Part 4, I'm almost done, so don't worry. Parallel universes. I want to be rendered redundant. I really wish it so. Like the state, that thing that was supposed to wither away. Maybe this is why I'm writing on a topic that is de trop, the internet, that thing that never sleeps even though it visits dreams. However, it was not I, but engineer Colonel, excuse my Russian for Russian speakers here, Anatoly Kitov, deputy head of Computation Center No. 1 of the Ministry of Defense, who was fired. Co-author of the first Soviet article on cybernetics and author of the first Soviet book on computers, Kitov proposed something radical to fix the administrative slush that bogged down Nikita Khrushchev's thaw. According to historian Slava Gerchov, Kitov, whoa, there's something missing. That's interesting. Computer mistake. Kitov, well, I'll just fill it in. He came up with the idea that computers could be inter-networked and that these inter-networked computers would go into the factories and manage the productions and actually make proper Soviet production. Interestingly, the next quote is here, so I'll do that. Although Kitov proposed a paired welfare system, in which persons laid off due to supercomputing would be taken care of, there was a discussion that they would be, if computers were taking jobs in the Soviet Union, and if the Soviet Union was based on labor, then you couldn't get rid of the computers because you'd destroy the jobs. This was actively discussed in the Politburo. In which persons laid off due to supercomputing would be taken care of, he believed that, quote, people in power were concerned that as a result of the introduction of computer technology, many of them would prove redundant, end quote. Not surprisingly, apparatchik ideology stifled this program from being born. Ironically, the Soviet project, which preceded the US project by several years, stoked American interests in a like program. Reflecting on the state of affairs, Gertov noted that, and the whole thing's missing again. Okay, sorry. Computer's trying to have its agency. He basically, Gertov goes to explain how the actual ideology of the Soviet Politburo was too focused on the political ramifications and how they were going to sell the idea to the people. Whereas when that faltered, the Americans, instead of being interested in the sort of political and social ideas, I'm being glib here and the quotation's much more close, actually narrowed the project to make it more technological and say it's more about the technology and about the circuitry and less about social interactions. Gertchov then goes on to stipulate that, isn't it interesting that we now have this internet that came from this military history in the United States when another system was being born first and that it was killed when it was more interested in social programs. And Gertchov asks then what is the power of metaphor when discussing science and politics? So I, in response to Gertchov, returned to metaphors. Juno, let's go back to her if we'd like. There she is. Juno, stripped of the state, is simply the goddess of the family, or more directly, the goddess of motherhood. As we continue to nurture more and more supercomputers, and possibly populate not only the Earth, but the entire sky with them as well, we have to ask, are we really going into this whole thing as responsible and mature adults? So that's that. Thanks. So I got 16 minutes on my counter. You're good? Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit more about some things.
I just wanted to say computers are also good for something, which is I was able to pull up the super community, and if you want to read those quotes, I can pass you on my phone.
Oh, it's up to whatever everybody else wants. It's actually funny. I know what happened. The eFlux's PDF generator hates those quotes, and sometimes it suppresses it. So I thought they were there, so maybe the computer does have more agency than we think. I was always thinking of a follow-up of this, and I was going to focus on Mercury, who, as I said, was interestingly the god of secrets, communications, borders, and finance, which is kind of a topic worth discussing, particularly in Europe today and other places. But instead, I was starting to think about something else, and I'm just putting a couple case studies together, and I'm going to share those with you. I like to do somewhat close readings of technology and think of where their history is and what they are. And I'm going to give you a kind of little taste of some of these things and where I'm going to try to move them. And it'd be great if we discuss it later. If you don't like it, whatever. That's a man named Herman Hollerith. Matteo had mentioned that a company called IBM started using these things called punch cards. Well, he's the guy that invented it, and he founded a company called the Hollerith tabulating machine, which later turned into a thing called IBM under very complex and different circumstances. What he did, though, he's an engineer, and according to the Constitution of the United States, I'm going to have a bit more US stuff. Sorry, that's where I'm from. According to the Constitution of the United States, as you may know, we have a legislative body, the Congress and the Senate, and the number of members in the representatives, and you've probably heard about this stuff with electoral delegates, and all of these are related, are based on a proportion of the population for your form of representation in the government. It also has other implications. But because of that, within the Constitution of the United States itself, it requires every 10 years the government to conduct a census so it can accurately create the information in which to create the government. This is in the 18th century, by the way. By the 19th century, the American population was exploding for various reasons. It was almost doubling every 10 years. And by 1880, they couldn't count fast enough. They had the last census from 1870, and they still hadn't counted it 9 years in, and they were freaking out, and they were going to go, what are we going to do? We're going to have a constitutional crisis, blah, blah, blah. So like the government likes to do, like the Argus Project or whatever, they sent out a call for proposals for various inventors and corporations to figure out a way to fix this and solve it. A whole bunch of proposals came in. Hollerith came up with this machine called the tabulating machine. It's electromechanical. I can tell you more about that later if you want. And it uses punch card technology, which is something Matteo had spoken about, which has, of course, as he had mentioned, lineage back to the Jacquard loom, which even it itself actually goes back to a further technology of automatic playing organs, and that even goes back further to a thing called the camshaft, but that's a much longer story. But I'm not going to talk about that because that's only one aspect of the machine that Hollerith created, and his machine is a lot more interesting because that is only one other aspect. In addition to making the program, as we call them now, the punch card, he actually made the interface, which is these counters up top there. You can see the cards are in his hand. And more importantly, what I'm going to want to talk about is the storage system, which is that little box next to the whole thing. And basically what Hollerith did is he took something shaped on the size of the US dollar because it was a standard size at the time. There's some debate if he actually did know about Jacquard or not, and in the loom it's not exactly historically established properly. But in any case, there was other forms of notations where you would have a field, and in that field you would have categories which you could make out of criteria. So at the time, by 1880, the United States, since they couldn't actually calculate too much information, the census didn't have very much biometrics. It basically had man, woman, and that's about it, a few other things. What Hollerith noticed was that if he could speed up counting, he could also add more information. And I'll get into that in a second. And particularly the information he added was biometrics, including things like race, which we'll talk about. But what happens is a person comes and gets interviewed by a person, and I say, I'm a white male from New York, my family is from the Ukraine, etc. And you could punch each of these categories if they existed on the card, and you'd have a card with little holes in it, right? What you would do, if you can see it on the table here, is this working? This little like waffle iron thing had a whole bunch of pins and a whole bunch of holes, and those holes corresponded to where the fields were on the paper. And if there was a hole, the pin would go down and go through the paper and go into a little bath of mercury where there was electromagnetic charge. It would complete a circuit, and that circuit would tick one of the counters, right? If there was no hole, it didn't go down, no circuit tripped, no counter made, right? Okay, that's one thing, and that's where they started doing it. But this machine is not important as an early computer. It's important as an early data processing machine, which is a difference. And in fact, it's normally considered the first data processing machine, and that has a lot to do with that little counter next door. So what you could do is you could also wire the circuit in addition to moving the counter, but if you can see, there's little doors on the top here, and each of these doors goes into a little shelf here. And you could program those to open in corresponding to various material. So if I want white men, a door opens. If I want women from Poland, a door opens, and so on and so forth. And the person recording them, the machine can go in and read it, and then trigger these doors. They'd file it. And when they file it, they start segregating the information, right? And this is what we would call sorting or whatever now. And as you sorted, you can get deeper and deeper layers of information and analysis where you could segregate all of the cards that specifically were white men, and then you could send it through again, and you could segregate it from white men from Russia, and so on and so forth, down the line by iterative processes through using these drawers. What that did is basically what we would now call profiling, where it could take a vast set of data. This is about, I think, 90 million people by 1980. By the way, by the time he made the machine, the 1980 census was tabulated and counted in about 6 months. So we were gone from 9 years to about 6 months. So that's a great acceleration of the first era of big data. What this did, though, okay, so you have all this information, you know your racial profiles, you know your marital statuses, you know your population of the United States. Why is this important beyond the supposed constitutional law of figuring out what proportion of representation you should have in the government, right? If you believe in democracy and you believe in American representational democracy, of course, if you get more people in the Congress, you can affect that policy, right? So what people started doing, particularly white Anglo-Saxon Protestant men, decided that they needed to control the population so that their peer group would maintain the hegemony or the sheer number total of people in the Congress, right? So what they did at the time, of course you all know that one of America's worst, if not the worst, although there's no point in debating stupid things like this, history is chattel slavery of African Americans. This was, in theory, outlawed de facto, although that's debatable, in 1865 at the close of the Civil War. The United States still needed a labor force to replace that force that slavery had occupied, and they primarily started importing various laborers, like we have now, and in particular Chinese. And Chinese were building most of the railroad. A faction of the Congress, and if you're really interested, I can get into the proceedings in the Congress, decided that they were going to create a metaphor for why Chinese women should be excluded and why Chinese men should be included. Of course, Chinese men they wanted for the labor. They didn't want the Chinese women in because they didn't want them making families. They didn't want those families growing and then affecting politics. Might sound familiar to some other things going on today. So what they did is they took this data set, now that they had all this information of the amount of Chinese males and Chinese females coming into the United States, and they set the United States' first ever quota deciding regulating the immigration of these peoples into the United States. And that becomes one of the first racial excluding African American slavery, of course, but one of the first American policy laws regulating immigration based on race, creed, etc. Of course, we have overtures today. So let's just keep that in mind, and we're going to move to the other one. So you have a machine that takes a random set of data. That data can be fine-tuned to very precise information, but more importantly, that information can be marshaled and used for political agendas, which may or not have any scientific validity. Oh, the argument, by the way, that women shouldn't come was because they'll all become prostitutes. I'm not kidding. I can show you in Congress them saying this. So just going on the wonderful theme of segregation, I'm going to use a pun here and actually talk not literally only sorting information, but also segregation as in the urban process. There was, actually still alive, a Nobel Prize-winning economist named Thomas Schelling, who was, in the 1970s, a wave of economists that started to try to apply advanced mathematical thinking to regulate the system of the economy. You've probably heard of similar things. Game theory is an idea thrown out. But what he was particularly doing was using models. And how could you build a model to make an analog or a parallel of social phenomenon? And how can you study that? And then how can you use that model in process with a country, with policy and whatever to change things, right? So according to Schelling himself, he was flying on a plane one night and wanted to figure out why racial segregation exists in an urban center. And he decided to build a model. He went home, got a checkerboard. He got American quarters and American pennies, which is a brown and a silver coin. I don't know why he didn't use checkers on a checkerboard, but he's an economist, so maybe he likes money, I don't know. But point being, they're two different things. Here they're represented by eggs. It really doesn't matter. And we can talk later about the importance of visual representation or not. And what he did is he laid them out, and this would be basically a pretty even distribution. You can see, there's brown egg, white egg, brown egg, white egg, etc. And it's a pattern. What Schelling proposed is he actually set some rules to this pattern to make it move and study how they move. He called them preferences. You can kind of call them what we now call algorithms, and we can get into that. But what he did is, first he had to mix up the board because it was totally uniform. So he said, why don't I just remove a couple and then add a few so I can make what would be a random distribution. And it was often tried to be done at random in his modeling, so he would do this iteratively again over and over to work in as many variables as possible. So I found a little video where someone does that. So, okay, here you have the eggs, see? Okay, so now you have, as you see, you have a sort of a indeterminate pattern and a regular pattern, but also what was important for Schelling's study is you also have these blank squares. And that was for him a metaphor or really an analog of different blocks of development in the city. And what he did is this is the algorithm he said. He said, okay, let's say people, and obviously it's much more obvious here with white and brown eggs, let's say white people and brown people are not what they think is racist or they like their neighbors, but they just have a simple preference, let's say, of a rule that every white egg should not be outnumbered by more than 2-to-1 to brown eggs, right? So he said, okay, let's see what happens if I apply that rule to this model. And this is one example of what happens. Something very simple. I want 2 of things like me next to me instead of, only 1 of things not like me, and at least 2 or more of things like me. And if I don't like that, I'm going to move, right? So he ran that program, which you could call it if you want, and this is what happened. Okay, so as you can see, the white eggs are in totality separated from the brown eggs. And this was with absolutely no augmentation of his program, the 2-to-1 rule. And then he ran this over and over and over and over again, and every single time this very simple preference always turned into total segregation, almost like water and oil, to use another metaphor. This is just a thought experiment he used, and it started a whole field called sorting, which then became applied to a lot of urban theory and a lot of policy, and I'm not going to go into that in depth. But the reason why I bring this up is to show how in systems something as simple as one rule or one pattern, and keep in mind computers are binary, which is where I'm leading, something as simple as yes or no or 2 or 3 or whatever, when met with a data set, does have effects that changes the set, that changes the world, that changes the model, and when often implicated or instigated can change reality. I'm going to turn real quick to something fun I saw. This is about the United States primary system right now. I hope you get it. It doesn't necessarily matter. It's about Clinton and Sanders, and we had our little Sanders bird, so I guess we're doing our job for not having our fascism continue. So actually, there's a meme that's been floating around on the internet that's been very popular, and I found out it's by an engineer, and we'll talk about him. It's funny on the internet, you don't know anything. I actually found out who drew this thing. So that's actually one of the positive things on the internet. All these nasty things I'm going to talk about with sorting and pattern, they can be done in reverse. I'm not going to talk about that today because we were supposed to talk about the dark side. But, you know, dark light, you can flip all of these kind of methods and use them in and against themselves. But that's a huge conversation. So what this guy did, and you've probably seen this, is make what's normally called a flow diagram, which is used for a lot of problem solving in logic and mathematics, in building circuit boards, and lots of stuff. It's a very old technology. It's basically a graphic form. We had brought up mapping earlier today, which is amended it. Which is an important thing, but I like to, even though I'm kind of being a bit fluffy, you still got to go in and actually talk about what specific mapping and what it does and what are its agencies and how does it work and so on and so forth. This kind of mapping is called the flow diagram, as I said, and it's also called the decision tree, and we'll get into why that's important. And this is more just a fun example to show you how it works, right? So who should I vote for? And then the first question which is put into the program is shit broken? So if your answer is no, right, so to see how this leads to the line of questioning, the next question is, are women people? If your answer is no, then you should vote for Kasich. So think about that. If your answer is yes, I think they are, you should vote for Hillary Clinton, right? This is reductive on purpose. It's just to show you, more importantly, the structure of how this thinking works, right? So we're going to return back. That's one branch of the decision tree, right? We're going to fold back into the question, is shit broken? And of course, instead of saying no, you can say, yeah, shit's broken, right? So the next question that follows from there is, who did it? If you think Muslims, Mexicans, and the Black Lives Matter movement did it, the next question is, when is Jesus coming back? And if you don't know, you vote for Trump. If you think Jesus is coming next week, you vote for Cruz. And if you think rich people did it, guess who you vote for? Sanders. And I don't want to nitpick into this. There's some very interesting things going on there about misogyny, religion, and more importantly, how these politicians are using it and where the fundamental issues are being filtered. But what's important to note is this idea of a hierarchy in which a certain form of questioning dictates the discussion and narrows the discussion to very specific criteria. Just because I think people should get credit. The guy who actually did it is named Chris Law. They saw it going around on the internet, so he's like, I should make a t-shirt and make some money off of this. But it turns out he's kind of a cool guy because all the proceeds go to the Southern Poverty Law NGO, which is one of the major anti-white supremacy law advocacy groups in the United States and Mississippi, who also themselves don't do any fundraising, and they only do small donations, which has been criticized and commended in an attempt to keep impartiality. So with that in mind, I think he's voting for Sanders. This is another form of the data tree, or what's called the decision tree, where other kind of information, of course, can go into it. It's the same kind of model, yes or no, and whatever. And what this one is doing is it's actually predicting the predictability of if you're going to live in the Titanic. If you're a man, if you're a woman, your age, whatever, will you get on the boat, etc. When the Titanic sunk, of course. And here, it narrows the information into probabilities. So, 0.89% or 0.89 chance of surviving, etc., etc. We don't need to go into it. Just think of the structure and think of how it's now studying probability. So as you go down each node, you change the probability, right? So what do you do with really big data sets, right? Like surveillance, federal government programs and various things, finance, whatever. What you do when everything's random, remember Schilling just made that simple rule, and similarly Hollerith had this thing that would filter and sort and fine-tune and fine-tune and fine-tune. Various engineers in the 1990s, one named Ho in particular, thought, well, if you could take these things called decision trees, and if you could put a lot of them together, you can create what he called a random forest. And in this random forest, you have various data points, and they could be totally random. They could be, avocados. Actually, I'll show you one about fruit. And what happens is as information goes in, it goes into the filter, and as it goes into the filter, it goes down. And as the trees branch, what you're trying to do is you're trying to, if you see like this one, if you follow it, just ends here, right? But this one, if it comes in, let's say it's something incredibly basic, like male, then like Arab, and then like so on and so forth, if you get my point. It keeps on going down and 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 down, and it can reach here. Each of the connections, when people say corollary, corollary, well, it's a statistical term, you might have heard people saying it. What they're saying is that there's more of these variables are being tied and more dots are being connected. So the higher rate of correlation is that something can be filtered and connecting more things to move down this chain of hierarchy, right? Just so you know, this is the Brussels census where these things can be used. This is the 2001 Brussels census system, which used a similar filtering system to define what they called precision type for your house. And you see it follows a very similar kind of pattern it's still used today. And it's funny because when the system doesn't know how to count things, it just kind of doesn't necessarily cut people out of the census. It misrepresents who they are and what their position is in the census. I won't explain things in general, but if you enter the system at a certain time and the information goes in, a Bosnian and a Serb are just called Yugoslavian, which they might not like, and also does have ramifications when you start analyzing the data set where you have weird information looked into it. These are all just visualizations, so here are the correlations. You're going down, down, down the random forest, and so on and so forth. I'm just showing you these to show that they're semi-arbitrary, and this is a question we can discuss later with, if we want in the panel or not, or we can discuss after, about what's art's role, how do you visualize these things, what is data visualization, and so on and so forth. I'm just showing you that there's many forms of it. There's really no idea about what it is, but maybe there should be, or maybe there should be other ways of manifesting it. Here's a much more simple one. So this is how the correlation works. So like if you're red, you're small, and you taste it and it's sour, you're a grape. If it's sweet, you're a cherry. It's the same idea, yeah? When you pay a lot of money, you get fancy renderings like this, where the trees go all of this, and these are all different data points. In reality, it really looks like this. You start mapping things, and you start doing a thing called standard deviation, which is a form of a graph. And we don't have to get really technical, but that's kind of what you do. I'm glad Victoria had mentioned this. A friend of mine, as a joke, sent emojis, and this is a random forest in art parlance. I kind of like it. I would go there. So I'm going to turn to the last example, and this is where these things may or may not congeal, but keep these ideas going. I'm at 41 minutes. I'll try to finish fast. Yeah. So sorting, running things through simple filters, and so on and so forth, right? So this thing is a really kind of ugly logo. It's actually the logo of Skynet, the computer that gets sentient in Terminator, since we all love Terminator and whatever. But in that weird, funny idea called, does art follow life or does life follow art? It's actually an NSA program that's used for targeting drones, and this is actually their representation of it, which is totally bizarre. This was leaked and analyzed by various investigative journalists, The Intercept in particular, Ars Technica. There's a big debate in The Guardian about it. This week, about 2 weeks ago, people are not really sure what this is because you don't actually get all of the information because, it's from the government. Everyone knows what the NSA is, right? Yeah. So basically what they're doing in this Skynet program is they're looking for patterns. And to apply the patterns, they take random large data sets. They get this through surveilling people. And they check things like your pattern of your life, your social network, who your friends are, whatever, and your travel behavior. And they start clocking these things, and they start to try to build models. One of the main ways they do it is they use these drones still, and they use other devices. And they built a model of what they think the ideal courier, not necessarily a quote-unquote terrorist, but the person who's a conduit between them, right? And this is some of the discussion. A lot of super left people say they're using this thing to kill them. Other people are saying they're using it as a forensics tool. You know, like when the idea you arrest a low-level drug dealer and then you get them to flip and you go up the channel. That's some of the discussion. But anyway, so they're trying to catch these couriers who are moving around. And they think that they show up more often because they're moving around. And they start making patterns. One of the things they checked for, I don't know if you know this, but all of your phones actually have an electronic serial number. This is what is called metadata sometimes. It's one part of it. And one of the things they were looking for are people who had the same phone and would take out and swap the SIM cards so that they thought they were hiding their phone number, but the signal was still sending the information that the same phone, because of the serial number, was being used, and that phone was being manipulated through different numbers by using by using the different SIM cards. Other information like that, like where you travel, and if you happen to travel in places like Pakistan, you get checked a lot more. It was mentioned before in the introduction to Matteo that he studied the AFPAC region, which is Afghanistan, Pakistan parlance in military jargon. The problem amongst many with this model is they're kind of making this up and they're kind of putting the correlations together on their own, on their ideal of what kind of behavior one of these people may be taking. Of course, these people are not talking to them, so there's no way to really test if the information is being used correctly or not correctly. And what happened is, like your credit score, and these are where these applications also are. This is not just military, your credit score, your dating site score, your loan score, many, many other things are going to be worked on this, and this is a concept called logarithmic regulation, which maybe we can talk about later or not. This score would then give you a probability, just like the survival chance of living on the Titanic, and then it'd spit out a number, and then it'd be like, okay, let's check out this guy because he's really prevalent. The computer came back and it picked this man, who is a very highly respected Al Jazeera journalist. And in doing his job, where he was traveling around rural Pakistan, the United States security network determined that he's obviously a courier for the Muslim Brotherhood, and started messing with him a bit. It's actually, I just bring this particular story up, and I think it's one of the reasons, part of the reasons why the journalists called on it is it's actually interesting that he's a journalist, so maybe it wasn't a mistake. But more importantly, he's not part of the Muslim Brotherhood. He did have contact with these people because he was doing investigative journalism and was interviewing them and doing field work. In fact, he's probably on their side, whatever the hell that means. But what the machine spit out is a concept called the false positive, which is when you get a reading that says something, but it's actually not accurate. So, let's say you go to the doctor and you take a strep throat test, and the test says positive, but you really don't have it, and the machine made a mistake, and then you get treated for it, right? That's called a false positive. The random data, the random forest correlation created this system. This is the standard deviation, whatever, we can get really into it or not. What happened was the rhetoric, and this is a very long conversation, the rhetoric of American military and also how the stuff is served legally, is these systems are very precise. And it's because of their precision we should trust them. So the level of which they get these false positives or not determines or is what they use, let's say, as rhetoric to install these systems or not. And then, as I said, these are not only for military applications, these can be applied to and they are starting to be applied to, your probability of wanting to buy X, Y, Z, or whatever, and that has other ramifications. So the NSA got really happy. They said our computer that is kind of based on nonsense, but, doing all of these filters, got down to a false positive rating of 0.18%. And everyone's like, whoa, that's so small, that's cool, right? Problem is, 55 million people live in Pakistan. 0.18% of the population is 99,000 people. So 99,000 times, or let's just even imagine it's correct once, 89,999 times, it's telling the security forces that an innocent person and actually in the real meaning of the word innocent, not guilty, actually had nothing to do with this, is a terrorist, is a courier, et cetera, right? So of course that wasn't acceptable, so they came back and they said our target now, oh, I'm almost done, 2 more slides. The target now is 0.008%. Yeah, even better, right? Problem is by 55 million people, that's still 15,000 persons that could probably be misidentified. This is my concluding thing really quick. I'll do it fast. In the United States, there's several what's called burdens of proof in a courtroom. So if I'm on trial for murder, the level of which I have to be judged if I did it or not is very high. In a smaller court, usually civil cases, divorces, lawsuits, etc., you don't have that high of a threshold. And the high threshold in the murder case, sorry, I didn't say it, is reasonable doubt. Is there a possibility that's logical that no matter what the evidence says, is there still a logical idea that this isn't correct? And if you can present that logical idea, you're not supposed to convict. It's a very complicated and fuzzy subjective system, which is why they want precision. But anyway, in civil cases, this is much faster. They don't have that high of a level because theoretically you're not dealing with a person's life or whatever, so they have what's called preponderance of evidence. And preponderance just means if 51% of the evidence says you did it and 49% says you didn't, you lose, and vice versa. So 4 things say you did it, 3 things said you didn't, the 4 things when case is done, right? What's interesting is now things like assassination are being judged theoretically by this lower level of burden of proof, which is pretty dubious. But what's actually interesting is everything I just explained with the burdens of proof is for normal civilians. The US military is under a different legal system, and in that legal system, all members of that legal system are only tried by preponderance of evidence. And what's interesting is as these kind of things get shifted, and if these rhetorics continue, that the correlations are what's important, not the logical possibility that they're incorrect or the questioning of that they're incorrect. Actually, military style of justice will start becoming part of our civilian life through various other things. And I'm going to end there fast because I'm going over and we can unpack this more, but ta-da!